Beginning part two of our look into skeletal tissue, we're going to begin looking at the development of bone itself. And so, osteogenesis, ossification of the bones themselves, is the process in which we go from a cartilaginous type of a skeleton or a mesenchyme skeleton into a bony skeleton in embryos. And so, this process begins relatively early on in life. And then from there on, in the embryo through the fetal stages and through early childhood, we continue to grow the bone. And then even into adulthood, we then continue with remodeling of the bone and repair as needed. So for bones, the skeleton itself, it begins its changes from mesenchyme into skeleton that is ossified at about week 8. And so this ossification begins in one of two ways, either intramembranous ossification or endochondral ossification. And so with intramembranous ossification, we're basically going to go directly into bone. And so we're going to kind of have no intermediate steps. We're going to begin with bone itself. And endochondral ossification, as the name is implying there, we have cartilage. And so we have a cartilaginous base that we're going to begin with. And we're going to start by replacing hyaline cartilage with ossified bone. So intramembranous ossification is the type of ossification that occurs in a lot of our bones that are not long bones. And so this is going to occur in things like flat bones within them. And we're basically going right from mesenchyme into bone. The process begins with the inner portions of the bone starting to ossify. And so we get an ossification center that occurs. And this is going to happen with endochondral ossification as well. But this is beginning in the center of the bone. And we get what's called a bone collar that begins to develop. And so this is where compact bone is starting to coalesce and concentrate within the bones themselves. And this is starting to take on the normal appearance of bone. That compact bone is going to then be remodeled and start to be changed into trabeculae, and we're going to start to have red bone marrow forming on the inside as well. So as we take a look at this, we have essentially mesenchyme all throughout the tissue here, and so all of the tissue is mesenchyme, and then some osteoblasts are going to start to lay down osteoid. And so they're going to start to lay down the matrix that's inside there. And this then starts to ossify, and this starts to become the primary ossification center for this bone. As that osteoid then becomes mineralized and becomes hardened, any osteoblasts that get trapped inside become osteocytes, so they become the mature bone cells that are inside there. And in a sense, we're kind of starting out with kind of a solid bone. So the bone itself is kind of all a compact bone style of bone. And so we're going to have to start to do some remodeling. So that remodeling starts to occur early on within the bone, and we're starting to get the formation of trabeculae. And so all of these little arms that are kind of extending out through the bone are starting to form. Osteoclasts are now coming in and starting to remodel things around it within the bone itself. We now can see that we have some blood vessels starting to infiltrate. And so the cardiovascular system is replicating at the same time. It's starting to mature at the exact same time as this is going on as well. And so now we're starting to see some blood vessels infiltrate into the tissues themselves as well. And that really starts to bring in the building blocks that we need in order to build the bone at this point. Mesenchyme on the outside of the bone is now going to start to change one more time, and this is going to start to change into connective tissue to where we can now form our periosteum on the outside of the bone as well. As we continue to remodel the bone starts to form our compact bone outer portion on either side. We've got spongy bone on the middle. All of that is then filled in with our red bone marrow on the inside. We've got our periosteum on the outside surrounding the bone, and a layer of osteoblasts continuing to grow the bone. So it's continuing to thicken the bone, continuing to add to the thickness of the compact bone there. And as that occurs, so as this continues to kind of grow out this way, this portion of the bone here is going to be remodeled as well. Osteoclasts are going to come in there and start to break those down as well, so that we don't end up with bone that just becomes thicker and thicker and thicker all the way through the outside. We've got to, even though this bone has to grow tremendously from the point of 8 weeks development all the way up until adulthood, we don't want that process, in a sense, to create thick bone. So we're going to constantly remodel and take away some of that bone from the inside. Endochondral ossification starts to begin at the same time, and this, instead of going essentially directly from mesenchyme into bone, we're going to start out by making hyaline cartilage. And so the mesenchyme is going to convert into hyaline cartilage, and that hyaline cartilage is going to serve kind of like a scaffolding. This is going to be the basis for making all the rest of the bone that's there. So we're going to start out with kind of this shell that is hyaline cartilage, and then that hyaline cartilage is then going to undergo ossification. So initially, once again, we're going to start endochondral ossification by having a primary ossification center, and that primary ossification center is going to develop a bone collar. From there, the hyaline cartilage is going to start to be broken down, and so we're going to get kind of pockets forming in there. We're going to get cavitation of the hyaline cartilage, and within that, the osteoblasts are going to start to form, and we're going to start to see the formation of spongy bone in the center of the bone. So the primary ossification center begins at the center of the bone itself, and so this is going to be where the diaphysis of the bone eventually is. The epiphyses of the bone will eventually start to ossify as well, and they're going to become what we call our secondary ossification centers. And so those are going to be at the ends of the bones themselves. As the primary ossification center, so if this is our bone here, as it continues to grow, and it's growing in a sense in both directions here, out towards the epiphyses of the bone then, whatever the bone happens to be there, they're starting to ossify as well, and their ossification is moving inward. And so they eventually are going to meet together, and that's going to leave us our growth plate. And so we're going to have that growth plate in between the two portions, the diaphysis and the epiphysis that are there. So here we have in picture form the same process. So we get the formation of our bone collar. We have that primary ossification center growing in the center of our long bone. From there, we're getting cavitation and destruction of the hyaline cartilage on the inside there. And so that's starting to occur in that primary ossification center. Again, it takes a little while for blood vessels to start to infiltrate all of that hyaline cartilage as well, and come into that primary ossification center. The secondary ossification centers then begin out in the epiphyses of the bone, at the ends of the bones themselves, and they continue to grow and are working their way towards the diaphysis until eventually the two of them meet. And so we then end up with this growth plate here, or this epiphyseal plate that is there within the bone itself. And that's going to stay hyaline cartilage until the bone is done growing. And so we're going to continue to have that growth center there. And when that does grow, it's going to grow towards the epiphysis. So it's going to grow from the diaphysis towards the epiphysis, essentially adding more and more and more tissue on there. And it's essentially pushing that epiphysis off. And so it's moving it off of the tissue that's there and pushing it away from the center. In order to make sure that in the end we have a bone that has the same shape, we're also going to have to grow the bone outward. So we're going to have to do what's called some appositional growth as well. And that's going to expand the width of the bone, as well as growing it additionally into the length at the same time. And then even once we have that length change that's there occurring at the diaphysis, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, we're still going to have to do some places, we're going to have to take some bone away. Some places we're going to have to add some bone and things like that in order to maintain the normal size and position of the bone at any given time. So after birth, essentially the job of the bone is to grow. And so that hyaline cartilage that is in the growth plates themselves, this is going to start to continue to grow, and it's going to push that epiphysis off of the diaphysis. The cells themselves, as they go from the epiphysis, they're growing, and the cells kind of push themselves towards the diaphysis and towards the diaphysis and towards the diaphysis. And then eventually those cells will become ossified. And so they're going to start to turn into bone closer in towards the diaphysis itself. And so when we look at this growth of the bone itself, we see that we have areas of cartilaginous growth, we have an area of transformation, and then we have an osteogenic zone. That osteogenic zone, the last one that I was just talking about there, where we start to ossify the bone itself. So the growth zone is the area where cartilaginous cells are undergoing normal mitosis. And so they're rapidly dividing, they're adding new cells, and they're pushing from the epiphysis down towards the diaphysis, pushing the epiphysis ever further away from the diaphysis. As those cells start to kind of mature a little bit, the cartilage themselves starts to die off. And so the matrix that's around them starts to calcify. That matrix then starts to deteriorate inside there. And then we have our osteogenic zone. And so this is where new bone is actually going to start to form. And so on a microscopic image, we can see just that occurring. So we have rapid cell division. The cells are kind of oftentimes stacking up in columns of cells as they move through from the growth zone into the transformational zone. And then down here in the osteogenic zone, this is where we now have the calcification of the cartilage itself. It's now starting to become solid bone. And so this is going to occur within that junction between the epiphysis and the diaphysis itself. Long bones are our way of growing in height. They're the way that we're going to see kind of the changes within a child as they grow. And they're going to continue to grow all the way until their growth has arrested somewhere in late adolescence. And so essentially it's in the neighborhood of between 18 and 25. We're going to stop the majority of all growth, and then we're just going to have a few more bones to calcify and stop their growth at that point. But as that occurs, we have to continually do growth and remodel, growth and remodel. And so the remodeling process is going to take away areas where we have excess bone, and then it's going to add bone to areas where we don't have enough. And so in a sense, essentially where the scaffolding that was available was kind of too narrow, and so we need to add a little bit to it. And so with growth of the bones themselves, we have on the left side the growing process itself occurring, and then on the right side where we've had now this growth and we have to reshape the bone. So if we didn't resorb the bone in this area here, we would continue to have bone that was, in a sense, excessively large. And so it would continue to get thicker and thicker and thicker as it went outward. And so as it grew, we would end up with essentially a bone that was kind of really thick on the ends and then tapered down into a very thin bone in the middle. And so we have to take all of this bone away over here, but then at the same time, we've got to add bone over here so that we end up having a normally shaped bone in the end. So we're going to do a little bit of appositional growth here. We're going to grow in width, and so this compact bone is going to become thicker. But on the inside, again, we don't want it to become super thick. So same thing over here. We would then take away from the inside and just leave that cortex on the outside the normal thickness that we want. And take that away from there. And so that resorption occurs on the inside of the bone. We're taking away from that thickness so that we end up having a normally shaped, normally thickened cortex and medullary cavity that are there. And so the appositional growth is kind of akin to if you've ever kind of seen like lava flowing. And so it's kind of what I usually think about in terms of appositional growth, is that appositional growth is essentially this overpowering process that grows the bone further outward and outward and outward. Anything that gets in its way is essentially going to be incorporated into the growing osteons that are there. And so all along this periosteum here, along the osteogenic layer, we have osteoblasts. Those osteoblasts are laying down new matrix. That matrix then solidifies and grows. And we eventually get the formation of little periosteal ridges here. And those periosteal ridges, as they are growing, eventually want to incorporate them into a concentric circle. So they're going to eventually surround anything that happens to be there. And usually that what happens to be there are arteries, veins, nerves, things like that. And so those all get incorporated into the osteon that is forming. We now have kind of an osteon with a rather large central canal. And so that periosteum there still has two layers. It still has osteoblasts. And those osteoblasts are going to continue to add concentric layers until it essentially is just barely the right size for other structures to come through there. And so for the arteries and the veins to connect there. These, and we can see on this one here, we still have a blood vessel that is kind of coming off of it. And those are going to become things like the connections, our Volkmann's canals in between adjacent osteons that are there. Eventually, that periosteum that is in that central canal is going to be broken down and created into endosteum, so we just have a single layer of connective tissue there. Bone's growth is regulated based upon the need to grow the body, as well as the need to maintain normal mineral levels within the body itself. And so essentially from birth all the way until adolescence, until puberty, the growth of bone is going to be stimulated primarily by growth hormone. Once puberty hits, then testosterone and estrogens are going to be the primary drive for growth. And so this is why essentially once either the testes or the ovaries start to produce those larger amounts of testosterone and estrogens, we start to see that big growth. Somebody grows 6 inches over a summer, something like that, or 8 inches over a school year. As those levels of hormones start to rise, that causes those great growth spurts that we start to see. That's there. In addition, it starts to make some of the changes that occur to the skeleton itself. And so essentially we get the masculinization in males and the feminization of the skeleton in females, primarily centered around the pelvis in terms of females, but it also causes in males the entire skeleton to kind of start to become more dense, stronger in a sense, because typically males are going to have a higher body weight. They're going to have more force in terms of muscle mass, things like that, oftentimes on the bones themselves. And it doesn't mean that in terms of females that you can't have the same processes occurring, just from a hormonal basis, that's what we tend to see. In addition, those same hormones are eventually going to lead to the closure of all of those growth plates. And so it's the sex hormones that eventually end the growth of the bones themselves. So when bone is remodeling, we're going to have areas where we have osteoblasts and osteoclasts kind of working in concert with one another. And so essentially the osteoclasts come in, they start to break down the bone, and then osteoblasts come in right behind it and build new bone on top of the broken down bone that was just there. And this process keeps on going back and forth all the time. In order for normal bone deposition to occur, in order for normal bone growth to occur, we need to have certain kind of raw materials available. And so we need proper vitamins, we need proper minerals to come into the body. We need things like vitamin D in order to be able to absorb calcium. And so without vitamin D, we don't get proper absorption of calcium, which means that we're not going to be able to build proper bones in the first place. The calcium is primarily laid down as calcium phosphate, so we need a good uh, source of phosphorus as well. And so in order to make the two come together, we need to get them in our diet. That's there. In order for normal cell production, we need lots of protein. And so all those things need to be in adequate amounts in order to have normal bone growth. Bone resorption occurs because of the osteoclasts that are there. And so it said that the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts kind of work side by side and with one another in the bones for bone remodeling. And that area where essentially we have bone, and then we have an osteoblast kind of sitting on top of it, we're going to get what we call a resorption bay. And so kind of the space in between our osteoclast and the bone itself, this is that resorption bay. And so this is where the osteoclasts are releasing enzymes, they're releasing acids, which are literally dissolving the bone. And so they're taking all of that hardened bone, mineralized bone, and dissolving it and getting it into a soluble form so that they're able to actually leave in the interstitial fluid and then eventually into the blood. One of the things that osteoclasts break down bone for is to help to maintain calcium levels within the bloodstream itself. And so calcium is necessary for things that we'll talk about later on, like muscle contraction, like nerve action potentials, blood coagulation, causing blood clots in order to stop bleeding, things like that. The secretion of neurotransmitters and hormones from endocrine cells and the nerve cells themselves, and also important for normal cellular division. So lots of other places besides the bone need calcium. And if those levels are starting to, in terms of our calcium levels in the blood, if they're starting to fall, this is our kind of our levels of calcium, we're going to need to be able to bring them back up so that we maintain them along a median level. And so with that, we're going to use our negative feedback to bring those levels back up, and then they may slip back down and back up. And we're going through the normal process of maintaining calcium within the blood itself. We talked about the need for normal metabolic substances to come in through our diet. And if we don't get that, we have the potential to form improper bones. And so in a growing child, if they're not getting adequate amounts of calcium for the bones themselves, then they're not going to make normal bones. The bones will oftentimes become deformed within the skeleton itself, especially the weight-bearing bones. And so calcium and vitamin D are the two key factors here for rickets. And so with rickets, in a sense, this is kind of one of those scenarios of the chicken versus the egg kind of a thing. But it doesn't really matter whether the person has too little calcium or too little vitamin D. They're going to need both supplemented. And so, but a vitamin D deficiency by itself can cause not enough calcium to be absorbed. And so they're going to need to get it from their diet in another way. So with rickets, we see in children. In adults, if we don't have enough calcium and vitamin D in our diet, then we're going to get osteomalacia. And so whereas in rickets, it has the potential to cause things like the tibia to become bowed or curved. And so the bone kind of curves on itself there. In osteomalacia, the bone starts to become weakened. And so inside the bone, it's not as strong as it was, and it has the potential to then break once it's there. And oftentimes, the person may not necessarily know that they have a problem until they get that pathological fracture. So controlling the remodeling process itself comes down to one of two factors. Either hormonal controls for normal blood calcium levels, or mechanical forces on the bone. And so the everyday force that we put through the bones has an effect on whether we lay down more bone or whether we take some of that bone away. And so the hormonal side of things involves two hormones, either calcitonin or parathyroid hormone. And so as those levels of calcium levels go up and down and up and down, we have kind of our mean range where we want to be. My line's a little bit off there. But when we're trying to maintain those levels, if we get a whole bunch of calcium into our diet, and so our calcium levels are increasing in the blood, then we're going to release calcitonin. And so calcitonin stimulates calcium deposition into the bones. So we've got excess amounts of calcium here. We're going to release calcitonin. Now, calcitonin is then going to take the calcium out of the blood, and the blood levels are then going to start to fall. As those levels start to fall, or if we have not enough vitamin D or we have not enough calcium in our diet itself, those levels start to fall and they go down. Now we're going to release parathyroid hormone, or PTH. Parathyroid hormone is then going to cause osteoclasts to start to break down bone, and that's going to bring our levels back up. And that process is going to kind of keep on going around and around and around based upon the normal levels that a person has in their blood. And so we're maintaining those calcium levels under a fairly strict margin of error. We don't want them to go too far off because of all those other systems that are using it. Our muscles, our blood clotting, our nerves, our cell reproduction, all of that requires enough calcium in order to normally function in homeostasis. The other side of things is mechanical stress, and so the things that we do every day. This involves also body weight, the stress that we put on it from working out, from doing the different things that we do during the day all the time. And what it involves is a process called Wolff's Law. And so Wolff's Law basically says that as we put stress on our bone, the bone is going to remodel itself along those lines of stress to best generate a bone that is resistant to the stress that is being put on it. And we see this primarily in trabecular bone or spongy bone. And so with spongy bone here, we have essentially the stress of the femur being in the acetabulum. Our body weight is pushing down here, and that causes a force to go through the bone. And the stress point is down here. It's kind of like if you had a cane. The cane isn't going to break up here in the handle. The cane's going to break further on down the shaft. And with that, we're going to have essentially compression over here, and we're going to have stretching and tearing on this side over here. And if we look at it within the bones themselves, we see the potential for fractures occurring along those stress lines. And so we're going to see the trabeculae growing inside the bone, maintaining the normal amount of trabeculae there to resist the stress. But if we put excess stress on the bones, we're going to have a fracture. And so fractures come in many different kinds, and they're named based upon a few different factors that come into the bones themselves. And so the ones that we're going to look at are going to be kind of the basic fractures of primarily long bones. And so we have the position of the bones at the end kind of gives them their name, whether it's a complete fracture or an incomplete fracture. How the bones are lined up in the end, are they in normal anatomical position or not? And has it punctured through the skin? So when we look at fractures themselves, and so we can have either a complete fracture or an incomplete fracture. And so within that, this is essentially has the bone broken all the way, or is part of the bone left intact. And so is one side still kind of hanging on a little bit per se. If it has become a complete fracture, even in an incomplete fracture, are they in normal position? Are they in normal anatomical position? Then we'd have a non-displaced fracture. If the ends of the bones are no longer in their normal position, then we have a displaced fracture. And so this is where the bones are going to have to be reset. This is where the bones are going to have to be put back together in order to have them heal properly. With a linear fracture, so all of these fractures themselves are based upon going across the long axis of the bone. So we're going through the bone this way in a sense. But a linear fracture is going to cause the bone to essentially fracture down the length of the bone, kind of like splitting a log, so to speak. So what we had primarily were transverse fractures that were there within the bones themselves, so that's going perpendicular to that long axis. And then we have compound fractures and simple fractures. So compound fractures penetrate through the skin. We've got bone exposed through the skin itself versus a simple fracture, which is the majority of fractures most of the time. The bones themselves are still under the skin. A lot less complicated when we have a simple fracture most of the time than when we have a compound fracture. We can have comminuted fractures. And so comminuted fractures essentially mean that we have more than two pieces. And so instead of just having essentially the simple process where the two bones are fractured next to one another, we have a situation where now we have kind of an extra piece of bone on there. We can have spiral fractures. This is usually a twisting kind of a motion, something like a football play or even soccer. A person steps down, and they're either getting tackled in something like football, and their body twists one way, and the person twists them the other way, or they step in like a pothole in the field, and that causes them to twist around as well. We can have depression fractures in flat bones, and so in things like our skull, we can end up with a depression fracture where essentially you can think about this one as being kind of like a dent in the bone. And so with this, we've got normal trabeculae kind of coming across through the bone, and then all this trabeculae has become crushed. And then the normal trabeculae on the other side. The cortex on the very inside, if this is the skull, all of this cortex is still intact. This one's going to have fractures in the cortex there, but the innermost side is still intact. In things like our vertebrae especially, we can have things like compression fractures. Compression fractures are common in bones of the vertebrae, where we have the body of the vertebrae becomes fractured. And so what happens with that is that the body fractures down. And so it has become crushed on the inside. All of the trabeculae that are on the inside are now flattened down. More common in the elderly, and especially those that are osteoporotic. In the growing child, epiphyseal fractures are a very important kind of a fracture to watch out for because they cross the growth plate. And so this is something where now that growth plate is going to ossify and the cartilage is going to stop growing potentially. And so that means that that end of the bone is no longer going to grow. In kids as well, you more commonly see what are called green stick fractures. And again, this is where the bone has fractured, but one side of the bone is still intact, and the other side of the bone is where we see the fracture at. And so that side of the bone has become fractured, but it's not complete. It's like taking a stick off of a tree that is still living and trying to bend it and break it in half. It doesn't do so. And so the next couple slides just show some images of those different types of fractures. So here we have a comminuted fracture. We've got multiple pieces of the bone inside there. Here we have a compression fracture in a vertebrae. And so the vertebral body itself is now compressed down. A spiral fracture, it's going down along the bone itself and spinning around as we see it there. An epiphyseal fracture, so here's where the normal growth plate is. And so now this whole portion of the growth plate over here is potentially going to die off. A depression fracture, here this one's a little bit difficult to see, but it is there where it's kind of deformed down in. And then a green stick fracture over here. We have intact bone over here that's been basically compressed on that side in terms of the cortex. And the fracture point over here where it's actually broken open is on that part of the bone right there. And then next up, in part 3, we'll finish up the bones.